How will we power our future? Can we create a healthy and clean economy? Climate One at the Commonwealth Club is at the forefront of the global debate about energy, economy, and the environment. Bringing together the brightest and most provocative leaders of our time, Climate One is the place where big ideas get heard. With thoughtful and insightful discussions on policy, business, science, and culture, Climate One founder Greg Dalton gets to the heart of the matter. It's our future. It's time to come together.
Humanity is cooked, according to author David Wallace-Wells. In his book, The Uninhabitable Earth, he explores how climate change will impact people and could make some parts of the world unlivable. But is doom and gloom really the best way to communicate concern? Climate scientist Katharine Hayhoe says building connection over shared values is more effective than apocalyptic language. Later in the show, we'll talk about how meditation and facing down the darkness can be a way to cope with feelings of climate despair. Confronting and talking about the climate crisis, today on Climate One. David, welcome.
Oh, thanks for having me, and thanks for everybody for coming. It's great to see you.
How did fear move you out of climate complacency?
Well, I think the question sort of answers itself. I mean, the more I learned about the science, the deeper I got into it, which was really kind of over the course of 2016, the more scared I was, and that meant the more engaged I was in the urgency of the problem and the crisis, and from where I sat as a journalist, the importance of telling that story so that other people had the same reaction, had the same response. I was, I'm 36 years old. I was raised mostly in the 90s. I came of age in the 90s. I had a kind of very end of history perspective on the future. I thought, I knew that markets were imperfect and globalization was imperfect, and, the future was not going to be endless bounty for everyone on Earth. But I also felt that we could probably count on it getting better. And I thought that climate change was going to be part of that story, that it was an issue, it was a major issue, but also one that was within our power to address and control, and that probably the leaders that we had would be responsible enough to take care of it. I also felt that the story was a long one. I had sort of been led to believe, like I think a lot of us, that climate change was a really slow-moving phenomenon, and that meant that we didn't need to take dramatic action quickly. We could develop our way out of the problem. We could invent our way out of the problem. When I realized just a year or two ago that half of all of the emissions that we've put into the atmosphere in the entire history of humanity have been put into that atmosphere in the last 30 years, that really, really opened my eyes. It made me think this is not something unfolding that will unfold in the lifetime of my grandchildren. It's something that's unfolding in my lifetime, in fact, has already unfolded in my lifetime. When I was born, the planet's climate was relatively stable. Scientists were worried about the long term, but in the near term, things were okay. We're now at a situation where we're basically face to face with real climate catastrophe, and that is because of what's been done just in 30 years. The next 30 promise to be just as consequential. And we could, in those 30 years, choose to take a path that produces some incredibly terrifying, depressing, punishing climate impacts, or one that allows us to avoid at least most of those impacts and secure a kind of more fulfilling and prosperous and just future for ourselves and our children. And the scale of that story remains astonishing and kind of invigorating to me as a storyteller. It's an epic saga. It's the kind of thing that we only used to see in mythology and theology. We really do have the fate of the world and the species in our hands, and each of us who's alive today is a protagonist in that story, making choices, political and otherwise, that are going to determine that future. That's just incredible drama. And so in addition to fear, I was sort of woken up by the sense of that scale of that story, and as a storyteller, the need to share that sense of drama with any reader who would have me, basically.
So we live in an age of hyperspeed and hyperscale. We're here in Silicon Valley, and things have happened dramatically. In one generation, most people in the world can have in their hand, most of the knowledge accumulated by humankind, in all times. And just think about that. And that's really speed, and we embrace that. Yet the speed and scale of climate, somehow that's really hard for us to grasp.
Well, I think they may be related because some of the trajectories of technology have taught us that change can happen very quickly, and that especially if you have a lot of faith in the technological solutions to climate change, you can think, oh, these things will get figured out, they'll get sorted out down the line. I think that is, given the state of the crisis, really a problematic perspective. The UN says that in order to safely avoid 2 degrees of warming, which most of the scientists in the world consider the threshold of catastrophe, and island nations of the world call genocide, we'll need to have our emissions by 2030, which is basically a decade from now. The Secretary General says we need a global World War II mobilization effort against climate to achieve that, and that needs to start this year. And when you think about all of the components that would go into such a solution, the energy sector is one that we think about a lot. It's probably the easiest because thanks to the progress of renewables, we actually do have a ready-made alternative to our dirty energy sources. In much of the world, it's already cheaper than dirty energy, probably will be cheaper in all of the world soon. But some of the other sectors, for instance, infrastructure, industry, transportation, these are sectors that take quite a long time to rebuild. I mean, if we really want to zero out our emissions from infrastructure, that'll take quite a while. If we really want to zero out our emissions from airplane travel, we need to, first of all, invent a completely new kind of airplane, then build factories to produce them, and then phase them into our, the fleets of our airlines. That's not something you can do in a year or 2 years. And so if we really need to achieve all of that in the next 12 years, I think counting on, technological progress to solve the problem for us without real political intervention, I think is, a bit delusional. It means that, we're living in a bit of denial or complacency or, somewhere in that problematic nexus.
Now we're going to bring in Katharine Hayhoe, who's joining us from Texas Tech University in Lubbock, Texas. This is the first time we've included a guest remotely on the show. Katharine, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
So what's your take on the uninhabitable Earth? Your review of did it exaggerate the science? Is the title an exaggeration?
It is definitely a possibility, scientifically speaking, that large parts of the world could be uninhabitable if climate change continues unchecked beyond this century. But the most important message, I think, is one that David has already highlighted, and that is the fact that our choices make the world of difference. The planet really is on our hands. And when we look to the future, and my own work looks at future projections, the difference between a 1.5, a 2 degree world, a 4 degree world, the biggest differences we see are in the choices that we make.
And can an individual make choices that are meaningful? David has said that, the idea that we're going to recycle our way out of this or all go vegan, is that just kind of delusional, or can that have some kind of accumulated impact?
I appreciate his honesty, because so often we are presented with, if everybody did X, that would fix the problem. And we know as scientists that is not true. There is no one silver bullet that will fix this whole problem. And in fact, even if everyone in the United States, in North America, who cared about this, went to a carbon neutral lifestyle, if they could afford to do so, that still wouldn't even make more than a tiny, tiny dent in the overall magnitude of the problem. So that's why when people ask me what's the most important thing we can do, and they expect me to say, change your light bulbs, recycle, or go vegan, I say the most important thing we can do is talk about it. Because public opinion data shows that most of us agree that this is a real problem. It will affect future generations, plants and animals, people in developing countries, but we don't think it matters to us. And so that's why having this conversation is so important, because if we don't care, why would we act? And if we don't talk about it, why would we care?
David, you talk a little bit about how it's not a lack of information. It's not like more information, more facts getting out there. You use the word stories there. I think I'd like you to think about stories and lived experience versus one more report, one more podcast, one more book, because we've done that for 30 years. It's only gotten us so far, but it's not getting the job done.
Yeah, well, I see a whole variety of storytelling strategies, including just dumping the data on people. I mean, personally, I found swimming in that data really was a much more profound experience for me than if I just understood some top-line summary about, 2 degrees means X, 3 degrees means Y, 4 degrees means Z. Understanding just how much research had gone into each of those projections. And really, as a result, this may sound a little weird, but just how much could be wrong in that science without sparing us some quite terrifying impacts was really quite profound to me. This is not a matter of 3 scientific studies that could be disproven. It's thousands being done by thousands of scientists, and surely some of them will not come precisely to pass. But even so, unless we dramatically change course, we have so much more research to say, even if 30% of the science on climate is wrong, things are looking quite bleak. Unfortunately, I worry a lot that we may be retreating into self-interest and nativism, turning away from the needs of others around the world. And, Katharine talked beautifully about our kind of common humanity. I think that at the moment, too many people, especially in the West, are defining humanity in a kind of narrow way that allows us to overlook the suffering of all of those elsewhere in the world. And if we really want to come up with some kind of, global solution, it requires, I think, starting from a point of radical empathy and really believing that the fate and life of someone who's living in Bangladesh or Calcutta is just as important as the fate of someone living in Santa Rosa or Paradise. And from there are a lot of complicated questions about exactly how to manage a geopolitics built on that principle. But I think that we need to be doing everything we can to sustain those feelings of empathy and even grow them rather than retreating into narrow definitions of self-interest.
Katharine Hayhoe, you're nodding on that empathy point. The reality is, though, in a lot of climate communication, there's a lot of villainization of oil companies or certain political parties or certain countries. So talk to us about empathy and villainization as a communication on climate.
There's also a lot of villainization, obviously, of the messengers, too, if you don't like what they have to say. So when David was talking...
You get that a lot on Twitter, yes.
Yeah, just a little bit, like a few times a day. When David was talking, that actually reminds me of how I think about it. People often say, well, how do you talk to people who reject the science completely? And my answer to that often is, I can't, because even though they're only, less than 10% of our population is truly dismissive, what they do, because climate change, because rejecting that issue is such a core part of their personal identity, they are not able to relate to somebody who's talking about climate change concerns as a fellow human. And so the common denominator that I see, which kind of marks somebody as, are you a dismissive or are you somebody we can have a conversation with, is somebody who cannot treat someone else as a fellow human when they disagree with them on climate. But unfortunately, this is happening on a whole range of issues all around the world. And most of us are guilty of doing that, at least in part ourselves, and whatever our pet issue is too. And at this time, we're seeing an increasing fragmentation of identity around the world, an increase in identity politics at the very time when, as David said, we most need to be uniting over the concept of what we have in common truly is far more than what divides us. A number of years, I read a really interesting study that talked about how if we truly support democracy and we want democracy to continue in the future, climate change could pose one of the greatest threats to democracy, because the more disasters happen, the more power people are willing to grant to a government, the more likelihood there is of a totalitarian state as hunger, poverty, disease, lack of access to water and resources shortages increase. So this really is an issue of the future of our civilization, the future of freedom, the future of our political system, not the future of the planet, but the future of, again, every single one of us on this planet.
Can changing our consciousness hold off a climate crisis? When we think about the enormity of climate change and what it's doing to our planet, it's easy to get overwhelmed, even shut down by despair. But author Roy Scranton argues that may not be such a bad place to be. Scranton understands those dark places. As a soldier in Iraq, he taught himself to meditate as a way of dealing with the daily horror of war. Matthew Fox agrees, arguing that despair is, quote, a luxury we can't afford today. Rather than letting our fears overwhelm us, Fox urges us to use them in action. The theologian, priest, and author sees a silver lining in the apocalyptic darkness. He challenges us to use even the most dire moments as lessons that can lead us to a deeper place. My awakening to climate happened in the Arctic. Matthew, you say that the awakening can happen through darkness or through light. Edgar Mitchell was an astronaut who returned from walking on the moon and had what he described an overwhelming sense of universal connectedness. So tell us about awakenings, and then I want to hear about Roy's awakening to climate. But talk about awakening through lightness or darkness.
Well, all those examples are so wonderful. I grew up in Wisconsin, and Wisconsin, first of all, it has a lot of the morphic resonance, a memory of the Native American people on the land there. I had Native American dreams when I was young. And the seasons, and I lived in Madison, the 4 seasons were very strong back then before climate change hit us so hard. But just there was so much magic and there was so much beauty in being close to nature there in Wisconsin. And that just fed my soul as a child. And I realized how important it was to me. And when the creation spiritual tradition was named for me by my mentor, Père Chenou, a brilliant French Dominican with whom I studied in Paris, it just made so much sense to me that, yes, you begin with original blessing, you begin with creation, which is given to us. We arrive in this beautiful earth, and of course, there's troubles, that most of which humans have made. So it's not easy, but nevertheless, we're here, and it's marvelous. And that's really the origin of my optimism, if you will, of my experience of joy. Now, the darkness, too, and the apocalypse, which Roy writes about very convincingly, because he gathers the facts. I mean, that's what I like about his work, is that he's giving us facts. You know, there's a professor of science at Stanford, a very wise guy. He said to me one day, we're the first species in 4.5 billion years of the planet that can choose not to go extinct. But of course, he said, we haven't made that choice yet. Well, time's running out to make that choice. Time's running out to make that choice. And the other species, my dog, the whales, the trees, they're doing their thing. They're being real dogs and real trees and real whales, but we humans, we're still flopping around, building more bombs to destroy things more efficiently, and going about our business in a suicidal way. But the point is that the mystics talk about the God of light, cataphatic divinity, and the God of darkness. And that darkness, the dark night of the soul, which we're all in, I call it the dark night of our species today, is in fact a very special place to be, because it's in the dark night that this consciousness that you talk about gets opened up. And good things can happen in this darkness. And meditation takes you into that place of depth where you're at home with the darkness. Meister Eckhart says, the ground of the soul is dark. So if we're going to get deep again and not just live at the superficial level of that our culture wants us to live at, we are going to have to go into the dark. And so the darkness we're in is an invitation to go deeper. And when I've talked to a couple astronauts, and they've all had mystical experience, and cosmonauts, they all have these mystical experiences up there, and they say 2 things trigger it: the darkness and the silence of space. Then they look back at Earth, and Earth is lit up. And then you see the gem of a lit Earth against the darkness of space, and it unleashes capacities of awareness and gratitude and energy, therefore, to do something about the troubles we're in.
So Roy, did your awakening come through the darkness of Iraq? And I'd also like to hear you about when you became conscious of the real depth and urgency of climate.
Right. So it wasn't through Iraq that I came to understand the seriousness of our situation with climate change. And in fact, before going into the military in the sort of wandering years, I was a pretty active activist and protester for environmental issues and social justice issues as well during my time in the Army, and then afterward, going back to school, those concerns, of which climate change was preeminent, sort of faded into the background. I was thinking about American militarism, and I was thinking about oil, and I was thinking about the veteran experience and understanding how humans make meaning through war. And I didn't really start thinking about climate change again until I got the chance somewhere along the way, right, to go to this course at Cornell, the summer course on the Anthropocene, right? I didn't know what it was, and it was curious to me, and so I signed up for that. And for years I'd thought, yeah, climate change, it's real, right? It's important, but like it's something that'll happen in the future. It's like distant. It's just this hazy thing.
Polar bears and icebergs out there somewhere.
It's in the other side of the world, and it's a long ways off. And then that summer, prepping for that course, right? I read the IPCC reports, I read the World Bank reports, and read David Archer's book and all this stuff, and got caught up and realized that the extreme, like we're doomed. Right? It's really this was 2012, 2013, and then the IPCC reports then, and the World Bank reports then, and these are not radical institutions, right? They're not. They're invested in making conservative estimates, and even those business as usual estimates are just we're done. This is all done because it's going to get too hot, and second order effects that we all know about, rising seas, changes in wildlife distribution patterns, food availability, things like drought, fires, it's on and wars, on and on and on and on, are going to so stress what is already a stressed and perhaps exceedingly complex, right, system, and it's going to crash, right, and then things are going to keep getting hotter because there's already so much CO2 in the atmosphere. So
you wrote a book called Learning to Die in the Anthropocene.
Right. So that book came out of that, eventually sort of came out of trying to, this really, it was really hard to deal with. It does seem pretty clear that some new world is coming, and we'll make meaning in that world, so long as we exist as a species in the complex, manifold, tenacious way that we've made meaning in countless other ways in the past. The question that sort of sits with me and that I can't stop thinking about, and there's a practical end to it, but the question itself is a philosophical or spiritual one, is why is that denial so frightening? Why are we so afraid of letting this go? This is all going to change. That's manifest. And yet we cling to it desperately. We refuse to accept its passing. We refuse to accept that it's all going to go away. We can walk up to the precipice and think about it for a moment, and then we have to do something. We have to get up. We have to go fix something. We have to coordinate. We got to do something. We got to do something because it can't happen like that, right? We're not going out like that, right? We're a better nation. We're a better civilization. We're a better species. We're better beings than that, right? We're not just going to let this happen to us. And then we go back, right? We go back right into the same things we were doing the day before, right? We have a feeling and then we react to it, and we're stuck in this cycle of emotions and reactions, right? Because we keep denying denial. And there, in that space of negativity, right? In that meditation on the nothing, right? and on letting all this go, going through the process of willing to just let it all wash away, then in that space, I think something new might emerge. That space is where new thoughts are possible, right? New visions of a future that aren't just reactions to another vision we don't like. I think going into the hard, dark, difficult thing and staying there is the only way, I think, that we're gonna come up with something new, some new way, some better way to deal with the realities of the situation, right? To deal with what is going to be objectively a difficult time for everybody.
What can people do? Matthew Fox?
Well, as I alluded to earlier, I think movements are very, very important, but movements that must come out of a deep place, out of the place of spirits, of silence, of darkness, of the edge of fear and the edge of despair. A wonderful Native American teacher, Buck Ghosthorse, a Lakota man, he worked with me for years, and he said to me one day, in our tradition, he said, fear is a door in the heart that lets evil spirits in. And so he said, all prayer is about making your heart strong so that fear stays outside the door, does not enter, and drag along a lot of other evil spirits with it. And I think it's interesting that Roy talked about fear a lot today. Fear, despair, they go together. So we have to do this in our work because we have to build up hearts. Courage means a big heart, cur large, a big heart. And you build up your heart through joy and through beauty. Aquinas says zeal comes from an intense experience of the beauty of things. So if we're tempted to despair, if we're tempted to give up, if we're tempted to be couch potatoes and just kind of passively go through life and go through this apocalypse we're in the midst of, we have to shake ourselves up. But how do you do that? By falling in love. With what? Well, with the earth, with all the creatures, with whatever speaks to you, with the starry night, with the clean air, with the animals, with children, with poets and music. There's so much to fall in love with. When you fall in love with life, then the energy comes. When you're in love, your imagination runs overtime, right? And you find ways to solve problems. And so I think it is this igniting the fire of love that makes a compassion possible. And with that, like David Orr says, your sleeves are rolled up, we go to work.
Podcasts of this and other Climate One shows recorded with a live audience are available wherever you podcast, and videos and transcripts are available on our website. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time, everybody.
Mm-hmm.